If you got your Bibles with you this morning, let's open up to Malachi chapter 3. We're just going to hang out on one verse today. I know you're like, man, we can spend a lot of time on one verse, but it's a hefty verse, right? There's a lot in this that I want us to unpack. And to kind of recap Malachi, it's the last book of the Old Testament. If you're looking for it, keep going. If you start to see names that you know, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, you've gone too far. Go back to the left and you'll find Malachi. Last book of the Old Testament written. It's historically after Ezra and Nehemiah. Last prophecy that's given. And Israel here is in trouble, right? They are offering sacrifices that they know are not the standard that God has called them to give. These sacrifices are the lame and diseased goats or animals that they have instead of the best, right? They're keeping their best for themselves or to offer to other gods or offer to the government, whatever it is. They're withholding their best from God just because they're just going through the motions. They've reached this stage of apathy. Everything's just fine, but nothing is as great as they had hoped. And so we get here to verse 5, and this is how we started off the series, for us to kind of understand the situation and what is going on in Israel during this time. And this is the verse that God is really laying it into them of like, hey, this is what you're doing. And it says in Malachi chapter 3, verse 5, it says, "So I will come to put you on trial. I will be quick to testify against sorcerers, adulterers, and perjurers, against those who defraud laborers of their wages, who oppress the widows and the fatherless, and deprive the foreigners among you of justice. But do not fear me, says the Lord Almighty." I wanted to hang out only on this verse because I think it would have been one thing if Malachi, speaking on God's behalf, had just said, hey, I'm going to come quickly to testify against those who violate my law. But he lists these specific things, right? And so I think it's worth our time to say, hey, what are these things that Israel is being specifically told to avoid, and what does that look like in our lives? And so I think this is worth our time, and so we're going to look at why God is furious with Israel right now, that they had forsaken their faithful living to God and their obedience with God to chase after these other things. And so there's these several rebukes that we're going to look at today. And so the first thing is the rebuke of sorcery. So sorcery, what is sorcery? I don't necessarily mean like Harry Potter hats and like the robes, like I don't think it always looks like a wizard, I don't think that's exactly what he's talking about. But also we talked about a couple weeks ago about guarding your homes against other spiritualities, about the dangers of different spiritualities and horoscopes and tarot and communing with the dead and all of those types of things. And so I want to remind us that as Christians, I think sometimes it can come across like we're saying, hey, don't mess with that stuff because it intimidates us, right? Like parents who won't let their kids have ice cream because they want them to think vegetables taste good. You know what I'm talking about? My sister is one of those. My nephew's 3. He's still never been to a McDonald's, right? She just doesn't want him to know how good it is, I think. And so, it's like, as long as you can keep them away from the sweets, they'll think that apples are awesome, right? But the second you have a Kit Kat, you're like, well, apples are not this, And I think that some people view Christians' approach to other spiritualities as that, of like, oh, I don't want you to mess with that stuff because it threatens our spiritual stuff. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Because none of this stuff can measure up to who God is and what he can do. Listen, these other spiritualities, these other religions, they pose absolutely no threat to our God. There's no threat to God. He's not threatened by these things. And in reality, it's settling for something less than the power of God. And I'll be one of the first ones to say, hey, there is power in those things. It's just purely evil power. We see the power actually happen in Luke chapter 8. There's a story, we'll read it real quick in verse 26 of Luke 8. It says, "When Jesus stepped ashore, he was met by a demon-possessed man from the town. For a long time, this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, but lived in the tombs. When Jesus saw this, he cried out and when he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice, 'What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, don't torture me.' For Jesus had commanded the impure spirit to come out of the man. Many times it had seized him, and though he was chained hand and foot and kept under guard, he had broken his chains and had been driven by the demon into solitary places." Let's pause here for a second and let's recognize there's power in these alternate sources, right? right? Yeah? Is it good power? No, right? It's doing nothing to help this guy and everything to harm him. So in verse 30, Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, because many demons had gone into him. And they begged Jesus repeatedly not to order them to go into the abyss. A large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. The demons begged Jesus to let them go into the pigs, and he gave them permission. When the demons came out of the man, they went into the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. Here, we do not see the demons having any power over Jesus. If anything, you see Jesus having power and authority over these alternate spiritual forces, right? And so when we're warned, when Israel's warned against sorcery, it's not like, hey, that I can't, like you're bringing in stuff that I can't do anything about. It's a warning because it's on their behalf. It's like, listen, if you bring this stuff into your home, you're bringing evil and death and destruction upon yourself. And yes, God can intervene, but if you're choosing to go after these things, you're choosing a worse spiritual alternative, right? And so when we look at other spiritual practices, we would be foolish to think that they're not real and don't have power, but we would also be foolish to believe that those things are better than what God has for us, or that he can't overcome them. And so God rebukes sorceries because a lot of times it disguises itself as something that is from God, but it's evil. And so he's rebuking against this, and it takes glory away from him when we seek after other spiritual alternatives. Instead of going to God, we're seeking to give glory to something else. And so he rebukes against sorcery. Again, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. Similarly, we talked about his rebuke of adultery a couple weeks ago. There's this theme in Malachi that what they were doing is that the older men were forsaking their older wives to chase after younger women and bring their foreign gods into their homes. And so this version of adultery is really what he's kind of getting onto them for. It's like, hey, this is unacceptable. This is not what I have told you to do. Marriage is supposed to be a covenant that reflects God and our relationship to the people around us. His faithfulness to us reflects a husband and wife's commitment to one another. And so when we forsake that covenant for other people or for pornography, we're breaking and distorting a covenant between ourselves and God and poorly reflecting his covenant with us. Again, I hung out on this concept a couple weeks ago. We're not going to spend a ton of time here on this rebuke of adultery. We also see next is his rebuke of perjury. Malachi brings up perjury here. Okay, what if I told you, I might blow some of our minds today. What if I told you that thou shalt not lie is not part of the 10 Commandments? It doesn't say that. I know you might have been told it. Do we need a minute? Anybody need to gasp for a second? It doesn't say that. Can anybody tell me, before it's up on the screen, can anybody tell me what it does say? Bop! Bonus points for Josh today. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Exodus 20, verse 16, obviously this is a different translation, but you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. This is willingly lying to someone else's detriment, right? You are harming someone else with your false testimony. That is what it is for. Like, there's this story in the Old Testament. Spies are sent to go check out the promised land, and they're being hunted, and they find this woman named Rahab, and she's described as Rahab the prostitute. I didn't make it up. It's in the Bible, okay? Rahab, she takes these men in and hides them, and then the guards come looking, and he says, hey, have you seen these spies? Are they here? And she says, no, I saw them go that way. So here's the thing, is if lying is a sin, she committed a sin. But if bearing false witness to harm someone else is a sin, did she do that? Or did she say something that was less than true to save someone's life? You see the difference there, right? And I was texting with my dad about this, and he said, I think that the difference is, when you're asked the question, does this dress make me look fat? That saying no is okay. And I said, I don't know. I feel like not wanting to get in trouble is not a reason to lie, right? Like it's not like an ethical reason to not lie. It's a gray area, okay? I'm not going to get into that today. But this idea of bearing false witness is lying to cover for yourself or to someone else's harm, right? And so it's a murky difference, but I think it is important that when we're telling an untruth that puts ourselves above others or to manipulate the truth in order for us to be better off or to harm someone else or out of revenge or malice, that is a problem. Not only is it completely devoid of the love that God has called us to live in, but it sheds doubt on everything we say. If we're not people of truth, why would anyone believe anything that we say? And so if we're viewed as someone who will lie to get out of trouble or lie to harm others to save ourselves, what will people think about the truth of the gospel when we share it? This is why we also have to be really careful with things like misinformation and conspiracy theories, that it's like once we start saying those things or posting them on social media and then we post a Bible verse, you'll be like, oh, there goes that crazy person. They'll just believe anything, right? And so we have to be cautious that we're careful with what is true and we hold to what is true so that when people hear the gospel come from our mouths, they can say, well, everything else they've said is true. I know I can trust that person. We're supposed to be people who are called to live and exude honesty. Matthew chapter 5, this is verse 34, and Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount. He's reframing old laws that these people have heard and know before. And he says, but I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. He says, hey, this is how you've been told to swear an oath, but I'm telling you, don't swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Do not swear by your own head. You cannot make even one hair black or white. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. Does anybody else grow up in a house where you weren't allowed to say, I swear? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about? That's where this comes from. It's this idea of, and my parents always taught me, it's like, it's not because swearing in and of itself is wrong. It's because you should be a person that when you say yes or you say no, people believe you because of the rest of the way you've lived your life. Right? Now, I think it's also saying, hey, don't swear by anything else because you don't have authority over God anyway. But what Jesus is trying to communicate here is you should be people of honesty and integrity. And the people here in Malachi that he's writing to, they were not. They were liars. They were lying to get one up on somebody in business or lying to maybe take a little extra land than what they needed or to get their way. And so these people are living outside of truth, which again reflects poorly on God because these are the people who are proclaiming Yahweh. These are God's chosen people. And if they're viewed as a bunch of liars, who's going to believe anything they say about the one true God? We should be people who our word is trustworthy so that when we proclaim the gospel, it is viewed as trustworthy from others. The last thing is, I'm going to kind of lump all these together. It says, back in verse 5, it says he's going to come against those who defraud laborers of their wages, who oppress widows and the fatherless, who deprive foreigners among you of justice. I'm going to put all of this together in oppressing the vulnerable. This is a rebuke of oppressing the vulnerable. What I think is interesting is that some people think that taking care of the vulnerable is some like progressive idea. Or that it's like a hidden message of Jesus, that it's like, well, do we even pay attention to Jesus talking about taking care of those who are less fortunate? But what's interesting is as we see in Malachi, this was not something that Jesus invented. This is already established in the Old Testament. Not only is it established here in Malachi, it was established in the Levitical law, Leviticus chapter 23. It says, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God. From day one, Israel was told, take care of the poor, take care of the foreigners. This is not a new hipster Jesus thing, right? This isn't all the time. This is reflecting of God's heart for those who are oppressed, for those who are vulnerable. Listen, this is about as close to politics as you're going to ever hear me get. But there would be no need for government assistance if the church in America did our job. It is our job to take care of the poor. We are supposed to care for the refugees. We are supposed to care for the widows and orphans. Christians should care for the oppressed. James chapter 1, verse 27, it says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. This is what we're called to do. And it's interesting that he uses the term pure and undefiled. Uh-oh, we got fire? No, it's okay. Listen, let's go with them. We'll just all go. Let's get a cat out of a tree. Let's go. What? You have applications. Okay, there you go. Are y'all good for real? If anybody needs to go, you're not going to hurt my feelings. You're going to be all right. It's okay. We'll let them figure it out, okay? But we see this in James. I want to read it again because it's really interesting when we look at what it says in Malachi. Religion that God our Father accepts as what? Pure and, okay, hang with me here for a second. We look at Malachi, and Israel has just gotten in trouble for offering sacrifices. Were those sacrifices pure and faultless? No. That's what they're getting in trouble for, right? So we have this here in James that is a parallel that says, hey, pure and faultless sacrifices, religion that is pure and faultless is this, to take care of those who are in need. But the people here in Malachi, the nation of Israel, they were just concerned with their own people. They didn't want to help anyone who wasn't like them. They wanted to rule over them. They wanted to rule over the nations around them. They wanted to defeat them instead of caring for them. To contrast this, I want to look at a verse in Micah. The book of Micah was written before the exile, before Israel goes into exile with Babylon and Daniel. So when we did our study in Daniel, book of Micah is written before that. And so this is 150 plus years before Malachi is written. And this is one of those things I told you that Israel, part of Malachi is saying, hey, you should know better. Right? So, hey, you should know better than this. And this is where it comes from. Micah chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. Here's the answer, right? He's saying, hey, should I give all these sacrifices? Should I do all these things? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. What's interesting that we see here in Micah is that the purpose was never even the sacrifices to begin with. It was how they lived. It was, hey, I want you to live and be people who act justly. That word justly can also be translated, and I think is actually more translated as right. To act right. Act righteous, act rightly. Act rightly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. That's what I want from you, Israel. But if you can't do those things, if you fail to do those things, that's what the sacrificial system was for. It was, hey, I would much rather you live lives and be people who are categorized by these things than have your sacrifices. And so here Israel is in Malachi, 150 plus years later, that suddenly, not only are they not acting justly, loving mercy, walking humbly with God, but when it does come time for them to offer sacrifices for their failings, they're not even doing that right. This is a double whammy of failure. They are getting it wrong twice. They can't do right, and they can't offer sacrifices right for when they have done wrong. And so then it says, the last part of Malachi chapter 3, verse 5, he says all those things, right? He lists out all those things, the rebukes for, and it says, the people who do all these things, but do not fear me, says the Lord Almighty. I think it's interesting that it uses the word but there, and it really depends on which translation you go with. Some translations say and, some translations say but. But it's almost like God is saying, listen, if you were doing all of those things and still fearing me, it would be a different story. But you're not. You're doing all those things, and you don't care about me. You're not listening or watching for me. You're not respecting me at all. And what that reminds us of, what that shows us, is that there's forgiveness for those who fear the Lord, who have the saving fear of God. The saving fear of God. This is one of these key pieces to salvation. In reality, it doesn't matter how bad these people were, how much they did wrong, how terrible they were, how deep you are in your sin. There is forgiveness. There is forgiveness. So what does it mean to fear the Lord? I think this is one of those words that we use in church, and we use it in a different context than we use in other things, right? How many of you guys own a gun? All right, we got them. You guys can come in and take their guns. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. When you own a gun, there's some rules to owning a gun. Tell me, those of you who raised your hand, what are some rules in owning a gun? Don't point it at anybody. Perfect. Right? Always, both of you said the same thing from both sides of the church. Always act as if it's loaded. What else? Respect it. There you go. Anything else? Boom. Keep your finger ready off the trigger until it's time to shoot. Right? There's these rules, right? Especially don't point at anybody. I remember I had a friend, he was not familiar with guns. He was looking at my friend's gun and he's like, and they're like, what? Stop, don't put it down. You got to always act as if it's loaded. Then don't ever point it, even if it's not loaded, right? And some of the people who I know who own guns are the people who have the most respect for the guns, right? People who own guns, they're like, whoa. There's a lot of rules, right? You can't just walk around with it and be like, whatever, I just left it on the counter. My kids are out playing. There's rules to this. And is it because you're afraid of the gun? No. It's not that you're scared of it. Let's use that word. It's not that you're scared of it. It's that you respect what it's capable of. That's what I want to say. I want us to parallel that with God. It's not that you're scared of God. We as believers, we don't come in here and sing, I am scared of our big scary God. That's not what we sang this morning. It's not scared of. It's respect of what he can do. It is a respect of what he can do. I love this verse. We talked about it a couple Wednesdays ago. And I think this is such a great understanding. It comes from Luke chapter 23. This is Jesus is on the cross, and there's two thieves on either side of him. And one of them, here we'll pick up in verse 39 of Luke chapter 23. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. When we talked about this a couple Wednesdays ago, we talked about how beautiful it is that this short passage captures the simplicity of salvation. That he feared God, he respected God, he knew he was a holy God, he knew Jesus had no sin, and he knew he was guilty of sin, right? Pretty simple, cut and dry of how easy it is to have salvation. But what does the second thief, this one who does have a respect for God, what does he start with? He says, don't you fear God? His fear is what led him to salvation. And we see what is said here, that it is more respect than scared. That he realizes who the guy on the middle cross is, and that he is different because he realizes who this man is. Because when we fear God, when we are aware of who he is and this incomparable power and his holiness and how strong his wrath can be, and we realize our position is sinful, that's when we respond with the respect and the fear. When we fear God, we recognize his holiness, that he is not attainable on our own, that we are sinful and guilty of crimes that we have been charged with. And then enters the answer, Jesus. Jesus says, I realize that you've messed up. I know that I am unattainable and far off, and you cannot reach me on your own. I'm aware of your sin and the guilt that you have. But I'm stepping in to take the punishment from you. God knew that we could never make it to him on our own. So he took matters into his own hands and took the punishment for our sin, which made a way for us. Our relationship with God starts with a fear of God. If you're here this morning, you fall into one of these two categories, I want you to come talk to me. The first is that if you claim to be in a relationship with God and you don't fear him, we need to talk. Because if you don't understand the holiness, the power, the goodness of God, and how strong his wrath is for those who are opposed to him, then we have an incorrect view of God, right? If God is just a guy that's like, hey, I'm cool with him, nothing's bad. I know I hated those Jesus is my homeboy shirts, right? Because it's downplaying the holiness, the righteousness of God. This is not who we follow. We follow a God who will pour out his wrath. We study, Malachi here, he's very clear about what he will do to them. We're reading in Revelation in Sunday school. It is very clear that God, when he wants to, he will pour out his wrath and ain't nothing nobody can do about it. And so if we have this relationship with God and we're like, meh, and we don't fear him, I don't think we fully have a correct view of who he is. And on the flip side, if you're here this morning and this fear of God is making you scared, I want to talk to you about the safety that we have in Jesus. That when he took our spot on the cross, that the wrath that we deserved was poured out on him. And so if we are saved, again, that's where that fear means we don't have to be scared. We don't have to be scared because we can trust and we know that Jesus has already taken on the wrath of God. So it's not being scared of God's wrath. It's a respect. It's a reverence for who he is and what he is capable of. So if you're here this morning and you're saying, hey, I'm beginning to feel scared. I don't have Jesus who's taken that wrath on for me. Let's talk. I want to make sure that you step into the freedom of living in a loving relationship with God. Not a scared relationship, but a loving relationship that has the fear and the respect. To realize that this fear of God is good. Israel, they lost their fear of God. They're like, whatever. I'll give them whatever sacrifices I've got left over. I wasn't going to use this lamb anyway, so I'll just give that to him. I didn't have any plans this morning at 11 o'clock, so I went to church. No big deal. If we don't have a respect, if we don't have that fear for who God is, we don't have a correct view of him. But there is also such safety in his salvation. Amen?